An introduction. There you go. Click on the got it. We are commanded. On Pesach, we're commanded, b'chol dor vador, in every generation, chayav adam lirot et atzmo, ki'ilu hu yatsa mitrayim. Each human is compelled to see ourselves as if we ourselves left Egypt, slavery, a constricted place. This is the third year where we're celebrating Pesach in the midst of a plague. At my first socially distanced Seder in 2020, I realized it was the first time that I ever really truly lived into this command, into this mitzvah of seeing myself leaving a constricted place, because the social distancing, stay-at-home orders were new. And as spring was springing, there was hope for at least being outside in the midst of the beginning of COVID-19. And now here we are over 2 years later. And I think I want to permit myself to feel even more so that there really is going to be a departure from this narrow, constricted place. With the vaccines and the medications and the expansive possibility that we seem to have in front of us, with far fewer hospitalizations, even if we are facing yet another surge, it seems like we might return to something like normalcy. So a blessing for this year's Exodus. Felt deeply from the bottom of my heart. May liberation and love, health and wholeness be our inheritance. May we feel free, may we be free, may we feel whole, may we be whole, may we feel love, may we be loved, may we feel healthy, may we be healthy. And may, if you would like to, join me at the very top of your handout together, that first statement. May we clearly see the liberation calling out for manifestation and be part of the solution. For refugees, for Black lives, for all BIPOC people, for LGBTQI+ peoples, for those terrorized by hate, for those incarcerated, for those prevented from voting, for those most impacted by climate catastrophe. And tonight, we're opening musically with a South African freedom song that I first learned decades ago. And the words are easy. Freedom is coming, freedom is coming, freedom is coming. Oh, yes, I know. And I learned the alto part when I was singing this in a choir. So you might know the soprano or tenor or bass part. If you know it, sing along with whatever line you know. Freedom is coming, freedom is coming, freedom is coming, oh yes, I know. Freedom is coming, freedom is coming, freedom is coming, oh yes, I know. Freedom is coming, freedom is coming, freedom is coming, oh yes, I know. Freedom is coming, freedom is coming, freedom is coming, oh yes, I know. Torah states, and the sages repeat, that Yah, God, did not extend salvific help to we who were enslaved until we were woke enough to bewail our anguish at our oppression. So I wondered how many of us had to wake up to ensure that our call was heard. And today, how many more marches and rallies and webinars and testimonies and emails and texts and phone calls and lobbying visits do we have to make on any of the issues that we care about? In telling our story again this year, may we finally reach the shores of our liberation. And let us start by remembering the refugees of today as we remember our own refugee story out of Mitzrayim. Is there somebody who would like to unmute and read where it says reader? on page under the song. If you want to volunteer, just unmute yourself and go for it. Don't make me do all the talking.
I'm happy to do it, Deb.
Great, Jean, thank you.
Today, as we celebrate our freedom, we commit ourselves to continuing to stand with the more than 29.5 million contemporary refugees fleeing the climate catastrophe, terrorism, and war. They are fleeing from Eritrea, the Central African Republic, Somalia, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, South Sudan, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Syria. We are in the midst of the worst refugee crisis since World War II. We hold out hope for the day when every person in search of refuge in every corner of the earth can recall a story of freedom, reflect on a journey to security from violence and persecution, and no longer yearn for a safe place to call home.
And while Jean reads this out loud, we'll all read with our own mics muted, where it says together.
Never again means never again.
Thank you. I'll continue. The next portion of the Seder is when we wash our hands. Well, we're skipping over the candle lighting and the Kiddush, the blessing over the wine. There are two washings of hands in the Seder. Many people ask why. Usually we just wash our hands once. And the official hand washing is much later in the Seder, right before we eat, because that's usually when we wash, after we make motzi. So it's connected to the actual act of eating. Mm-hmm. But this additional ritual opportunity gives us a chance to reflect on water and the impact that water has had on our original departure from Egypt and has in our lives today. Rabbi Paula Marcus, a friend of mine, was the first person to point out to me that the word Pesach actually can be divided up into pe, which means mouth, and sach, which means speaking. So the word Pesach invites us to think, who tells our story? From whose mouth is our story spoken? Now, this happens to be one of those stories where there's a lot of women involved, but Moses is usually the central figure, and the conflict between Moses and Pharaoh is what we focus on. So let's take a moment to think about the women in the story and how connected they all are to water. First, we have the midwives, Shifra and Puah, who defied Pharaoh and made sure that the Hebrew boys, including Moses, were not killed at birth. And then we have Yocheved, Moses's mother, who had the foresight to place him in a basket and send him down the river so that he might hopefully be found and live. And that's exactly what happened. Batya takes Moshe out of the water, knowing she had to know full well that this was a Hebrew child, and takes him in as her own. His very name means drawing out. Miriam, his sister, watches over him while he was going down the river, sees Batya pulling him out, goes and says to Batya, hey, I can find you a nursemaid, and brings Yocheved, Moses' mother, to be the nursemaid. All of these women making sure that Moses lives, all of them connecting to Moshe through the water, women and water, water and women. In the earliest book of Jewish mysticism, Sefer Yetzirah, every letter of the Aleph Bet has the power to manifest, the power to create. And women and water are linked in that book through the letter Mem, which is one of the three most powerful letters. Mem stands for Mayim, water, for Ima, mother, Rechem, womb, and Rachamim, compassion, that which flows from womb consciousness. You'll see in your sheet, I missed the first together, the second together. Recite with me. birthing waters, birthing mothers, birthing wholeness through compassion. Moshe himself was named with the mother letter Mem, and given his role in parting the sea of reeds, literally breaking the waters open for birthing to be possible for our people, it is no wonder that our sages referred to him as our nursing mother. So there was gender bending in our Torah long before hundreds of years, thousands of years before the sages of the Talmud recognized that there were many different gender identities. Miraculous 5 mothers birthing a man who embodied womanhood. Take a moment to think if there's a woman in your life, a mother, perhaps, or any woman who helped birth something important, whether it be someone in Torah, or someone in history, or someone in your life, or someone who's a political leader or a celebrity that you want to lift up. So just unmute and share if there's a mother you want to pay tribute to right now.
I'd like to pay tribute to my daughter, the mother of my granddaughter. And I love every day watching how she is and how she nurtures her.
Beautiful, thank you.
I'll pay tribute to my mother, who passed away when I was a child, but I remember a lot about her, and she was pretty special.
What's her name?
Jane.
Mhm. And Jean, what's your daughter's name?
Ariana.
Thank you. Iden or Joelle, anybody you want to lift up?
I would like to lift up my mom. She adopted me 5 years ago. So very thankful to her and raising me and then adopting me.
Beautiful.
This is Aiden. I have lots of names, but I'll name just a few. First, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, Ida Mae, my birth mother, Mary, my godmother, Rachel, and my 3rd grade teacher, Miss Rosen, who was just absolutely so amazing that I still remember her all of these years later. And all the other amazing women that I've had in my life that have supported me when I needed a mother, when my mother wasn't around.
Amen. Beautiful. So just take a moment. We're in this time when we're supposed to wash our hands a lot for 22 seconds each time. So an invitation to a practice for you to remember those mothers, those women who you are celebrating right now. Every time you wash your hands, and send up a little prayer for their health and well-being if they're still around, and if they've passed, a little prayer for their for peacefulness and for gratitude. And let us say Amen. So the next section of the Seder is where we take a look at karpas, or greens, and the role that that plays in our celebration of the season. And this is a moment when I've excerpted some materials from the AJWS and HIAS materials. So before we get to AJWS, oh no, HIAS is at the top. So is there somebody who would like to volunteer to read at the very top of your page 2?
I could do that. Centuries ago, only those who were free enjoyed the luxury of dipping their food to begin a meal. In celebration of our people's freedom, tonight we too start our meal by dipping green vegetables. However, we also remember that our freedom came after tremendous struggle. And so we dip our vegetables into salt water to recall the ominous waters that threatened to drown our Israelite ancestors as they fled persecution in Egypt, as well as the tears they shed on that harrowing journey to freedom. Do you want me to keep reading? We dip for can you tell me how to say that? I don't know the word. For the, well, okay. We dip for the Rohingya father who walked for 6 days to avoid military capture in his native Myanmar before he came to the Naf River and swam to Bangladesh. We dip for the Syrian mother rescued from the dark waters of the Mediterranean Sea in the early hours of morning, still holding the lifeless body of her infant child after their small boat capsized. We dip for the Somali and Ethiopian refugees deliberately drowned when the smuggler who promised them freedom forced them into the Arabian Sea. We dip for these brave souls and for the thousands of others refugees who've risked their lives in unsafe and unforgiving waters across the globe this past year.
And my apologies, I was on mute when I was answering.
Yeah,
your
I
question.
figured.
But you pronounced it beautifully, Rohingya.
Okay.
As we align with the struggles that continue, may we also celebrate the bravery and success of freedom fighters. AJWS tells us, and Joelle or Aiden, would either of you like to read? All right, I'm going to read just so we don't have too much dead air time. When Hurricane Matthew struck Haiti in October of 2016, the ferocious wind and waves took everything Francois Innocent had. She lost her home and all her belongings, but did not despair. Francois began to help others, volunteering with Solidarity Femme Haïtienne, SOFA, a local women's empowerment group. Working tirelessly, she helped rebuild homes, organize a mobile clinic to tend to dozens of wounded and sick, and distribute hygiene kits to prevent cholera. Today, Francois is beginning to recover from her own loss, and she keeps serving as a beacon of hope to others. Kun Kit San is a member of the Shan ethnic group, a minority in Burma. His people have faced persecution because of their ethnic heritage and identity, suffering years of violent attacks by the military. Although Burma has taken steps toward freedom and democracy in recent years, the army continues to persecute minorities like the Shan, Kachin, Karen, Taang, and Rohingya by torturing civilians and displacing people from their homes. Kit San is just 27, but he has already dedicated his life to stopping this violence. In 2010, he co-founded Quang Roi Social Action Network, Kasan, which now works in 25 villages, mobilizing youth to become activists, community leaders, and human rights educators. They've garnered national media attention for their cause and are inspiring a new generation to fight for equality, justice, and peace. And finally, covering their faces with scarves to maintain their anonymity, 15 Guatemalan women courageously testified in 2016 before a war crimes tribunal about their harrowing experiences of abuse at the hands of soldiers during Guatemala's 36-year civil war. They faced intimidation and threats for telling their stories, but persevered, saying, "We are telling the truth, we want to be heard, and we want justice." Ultimately, they got the justice they sought, and in an unprecedented victory, the two military officials were sentenced to a total of 360 years in prison. I'll drink to that. This is just water, by the way. Anybody knows of a story of an individual story of someone in a current day refugee crisis that you want to share, or if you know the story of a refugee experience within your own family that you want to share, the floor is open so that we connect ourselves to these larger struggles.
Sure, I'll share one short thing. My paternal grandmother was a refugee. Her family came from Russia, and I know my father always used to say that it was just straight out of Fiddler on the Roof. Basically same story. And I just recently listened to a recording I have of her that a very wise person made just a couple of years before she died. And unfortunately, she already had some dementia at that time, but she did talk about the journey here, how that because they didn't have money, they could only afford to be in the steerage class, which is way down on the bottom where there were no windows, and there was no food. You had to bring your own food, but I don't know how many weeks the trip was on the boat, but they said that they were hungry. There were rats. She talked about some nice man who would bring them some food every now and then from up above or something. And she talked about how dreadful, she said she just wanted to die the whole trip. And they had to come across a couple of people at a time. I guess they didn't have money to send everybody at once or something. So they came in bits and pieces. So that was that.
Thank you for sharing. Does anybody else want to contribute a story from your own life?
My maternal grandfather, a similar story, came by himself at 17 from Poland, trying to avoid conscription. Would not have been good for a Jew to be conscripted into the army there. And he came also in steerage, didn't speak any English, and went on to be successful. He was the kind of the religious patriarch of our family. And my strongest memory of seders as a child was when he would take a big chunk of the horseradish and eat it. And I thought, his head was going to explode. He would turn bright red and the tears would go streaming down his face. And it was a success story, but with it a sadness for me, because as a young boy, I was an adolescent. I didn't appreciate who he was, and I didn't take the time to hear his stories. And he wanted so much I was his only grandson, and he wanted so much to spend time with me, but I wasn't having any of it. And that is one of my lifelong sadnesses that I've tried to make amends for 60 years. So.
Thank you for sharing that, Jean. As children, we do a lot of things that are, we wish we had done differently. So an invitation, there's a HIAS, the Jewish Refugee Assistance Organization, which has been around for over 100 years. I think it's their tagline that says 100 years ago, HIAS supported refugees because refugees were Jews. And today, HIAS support refugees because we are Jews. So that it's in our blood.
Mm-hmm.
In our blood to give back to those in need, because we walked in their shoes. So just an invitation to remember that the work is ongoing. The work is ongoing and the connection is ongoing, and we can pay forward. We can pay forward even if we didn't do enough to connect with our own families. And our families didn't always make it easy. A lot of them didn't want to talk about their experiences. Understandably, they came here for a better life. The next part of the Seder service is Yachatz, where we break the matzah. And it's an opportunity to think about brokenness. And there's just so much brokenness in the world. It's overwhelming, right? Overwhelming. Hate is on the rise. The Ukraine was just invaded by Russia. Thank God Trump is no longer in office, but the federal government just decided that it's going to discontinue, I don't know, something 42, Title 42, where it was prohibiting all of these immigrants who are climate refugees and terrorism refugees at the southern border from coming in, because of COVID, claiming that they present a health risk. There's just, we could go on and on and on, so much brokenness. So for this part of the Seder, the teaching part of the Seder, I want to lift up a poem written by a friend of mine, Allison Luderman, an ode really to a modern hero, Emma Gonzalez, who you may remember the name, was one of the student activists in Florida after the mass shooting a few years ago, taking the lead against gun violence and for gun control. For Emma Gonzalez and the other student activists. I see her on TV screaming into a microphone. Her head is shaved. She is beautiful. And 17, and her high school was just shot up. She's had to walk by friends lying in their own blood. Her teacher bleeding out, and she's my daughter, the one I never had. And she's your daughter, and everyone's daughter. And she's her own woman in the fullness of her young fire, calling bullshit on politicians who take money from the gun makers. Tears rain down her face, but she doesn't stop shouting. She doesn't apologize. She keeps calling them out, all of them, all of us who didn't do enough to stop this thing. And you can see the gray faces of those who have always held power contort, utterly baffled, to face this new breed of young woman, not silky, not compliant, not caring if they call her a 10 or a troll. And she cries, but she doesn't stop yelling truth into the microphone. Though her voice is raw and shaking, and the Florida sun is molten brass. I'm 3,000 miles away, thinking how Neruda said the blood of the children ran through the streets without fuss, like children's blood. Only now they are raising a fuss, shouting down the walls of Jericho. And it's not that we road-weary elders have been given the all clear exactly, but our shoulders do let down a little. We breathe from a deeper place. We say to each other, well, it looks like the baton may be passing to these next runners, and they are fleet as thought, fiery as stars. And we take another breath and say to each other, the baton has been passed, and we set off them, running hard behind them. If there's anyone you want to name right now who's in the next generation that you want to lift up, a sister of Emma Gonzalez in spirit, floor is open.
Mrs. Iden, I don't have any specific names, but I do want to uplift all of the young people who have been in the streets since 2020, the summer of 2020, and continue to be in the streets, who've been arrested, some have been murdered, lost their jobs, are homeless because of the activism that they are doing. So I uplift all of them.
Thank you. May they be safe and healthy and protected. And may abundance flow their way for the incredible generosity of spirit and bravery that they're exhibiting in this very painful time. Anybody else?
Not specifically raising up a person, but as an old white man, I feel guilt, and I feel like God bless that our grasp on power is ending.
Mm.
You know,
Amen.
because we didn't do such a good job.
Mm. The winds of change are here, and birthing is painful and bloody and messy, and always takes longer than we think it's gonna, or than we want it to, right? Yeah, birthing this new world is hard, and yes, thank God. Moving into the Magid, or the storytelling portion, where in the traditional Seder, there's so many parts of this. There's the 4 questions, and there's asking, why is this night different from every other night? And we're going to start our Seder tonight, our Seder facsimile tonight, with some words from the Israeli Black Panther Haggadah. And if you would all mute yourselves, and together we can recite page 4. There have been slaves in many Egypts. Now we are freer, and we can imagine freedoms once unimaginable, but still so very, very many are not free. Joelle, would you be willing to read from where it says reader from the Israeli Black Panther Haggadah?
Absolutely.
Think.
So what makes this night different from all other nights? That on every other night we barely eat bread and water, and on this night we don't even have matzah and water. On that on every other night we eat only vegetables, and on this night the government treats us like cattle. That on every other night we all shiver from the cold, and on this night our sadness is clear for all to behold. That on every other night we sleep on the floor, and that's something that the Israeli government should abhor. They want to make us slaves in Israel, but the Black Panthers will take us out by the club. For whether with a mighty hand or with an outstretched arm, we will no longer be ridiculed and mocked in every home. 5. And if the Black Panthers do not lead us from slavery to freedom, we will remain as our parents and our children and our children's children, enslaved in Israel forever. And even though we are all criminals through no fault of our own, we are all screwed up, we are all oppressed, we are all embittered, still we are commanded to speak out against the government. And if you speak out, that would truly be a mitzvah.
Thank you. Another variation on the 4 questions that comes from a document called Crying Out Against Mass Incarceration, written by the Jewish Working Group to End the New Jim Crow. Somebody want to volunteer to read the first question, number 1? Jean?
Why does America have the highest incarceration rate of any developed nation in the world? Many factors contributed, including the war on drugs, the imposition of mandatory minimum sentencing, and privatization of prisons, which creates financial incentives for keeping people in prison. The impact of the drug war has been astounding. In less than 30 years, the US penal population exploded from around 300,000 to more than 2 million, with drug convictions accounting for the majority of the increase. The United States now by far has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Incarceration is a tool of social control. Drug crime was declining, not rising, when the drug war was declared in 1972. From a historical perspective, however, the lack of correlation between crime and punishment is nothing new. Sociologists have frequently observed that governments use punishment primarily as a tool of social control, and thus the extent or severity of punishment is often unrelated to actual crime patterns.
Thank you. Ava, would you mind reading question number 2?
Okay.
Thanks.
Who is being locked up in the United States? No other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial or ethnic minorities. The United States imprisons a larger percentage of its Black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. In Washington, D.C., about 3 out of 4 young Black men, nearly all those in the poorest neighborhoods, expect to serve time in prison. Similar rates of incarceration can be found in Black communities across America. These stark racial disparities cannot be explained by rates of drug crime. People of all colors use and sell illegal drugs at remarkably similar rates, yet our nation's prisons and jails are overflowing with Black and brown drug offenders. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us.
Thank you. I'll read number 3. Why are so many African Americans as well as other people of color being treated like criminals? Mass incarceration is a tool to reinforce a racial caste system in the United States. Slavery defined what it meant to be Black, a slave, and Jim Crow defined what it meant to be Black, a second-class citizen. Today, mass incarceration defines the meaning of Blackness in America. Black people, especially Black men, are criminals. That is what it means to be Black. The temptation is to insist that Black men, quote, choose to be criminals. The system does not make them criminals, at least not in the way that slavery made Black slaves or Jim Crow made them second-class citizens. The myth of choice here is seductive, but must be resisted. African Americans are not significantly more likely to use or sell prohibited drugs than whites, but they are made criminals at a drastically higher rate. Studies suggest that white professionals may be the most likely of any group to have engaged in illicit and illegal drug activity in their lifetime, yet they, of course, are the least likely to be made criminals. Black people have been made criminals by the war on drugs to a degree that dwarfs its effect on other racial and ethnic groups, especially whites. And the process of making them criminals has produced racial stigma. Joelle, would you mind reading number 4?
Sure. Why do we as Jews and friends of Jews ask these questions on the Seder night? We cried out to the Eternal One, the God of our ancestors, who heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. There are Jews of color who have personal stories to tell about experiencing racism. There are Jews of all color who have personal stories to tell about incarceration and the criminal justice system. But the issue affects us all. Whether or not we have a personal stories to tell, as the people of the Exodus, we are called to witness the suffering of our neighbors, to open our eyes and cry out in the name of justice. Then the Eternal One freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and awesome power, and signs and portents. Dismantling the system of mass incarceration and creating a system of justice and dignity for all Americans calls for wisdom, perseverance, hard work, and faith. We must raise our voices and build alliances. We pray for the ability to see clearly, to act with compassion, and to forgive ourselves for the ways we have unknowingly been agents of oppression. We pray for courage, guidance, and strength as we celebrate Passover, our festival of freedom.
If you wouldn't mind continuing to the end of this section.
Sure.
Thank
When
you.
Moses led the Jews out of Egypt, it was a moment of great risk and great change. Though life under Pharaoh was cruel and crushing, it was also familiar, a known fear. After a century of servitude, freedom, what changed? It was the Jewish people daring to imagine for themselves something greater, daring to take great risks and face great fears to find liberation. This willingness to stand up for justice is a strength we have found again and again. When the oppression of economic exploitation demanded it, our grandparents found it in the labor movement. When the civil rights movement demanded it, our parents traveled to the South to register voters. Now, this moment demands again that we take risks for justice. What our neighbors and communities of color are asking, what the Jews of color in our own communities need from their fellow Jews, is that we push past the comfortable and move to action. In the streets, in our synagogues and homes, with our voices, our bodies, our money and resources, with our imaginations. In doing so, we must center the voices and the leadership of Jews of color and other communities of color when forming deep partnerships and long-term commitments to fight for lasting change. Passover is a time of remembrance, but also one of renewal, of looking ahead toward the spring and new growth that will sustain us through the seasons to come. Once we spent spring in the desert, it was harsh and difficult. From that journey grew a people who have endured for centuries. What would happen if we took the journey again, not alone in the wilderness, but surrounded by friends and allies, leaving no one behind?
What would happen? What would happen? If anybody has a story, personal story, that you want to share of incarceration, unjust incarceration, or of work that you are involved with or that you know of to confront the criminal injustice system, the floor is open. I will start by saying that for 5 years, I worked in Portland, Oregon, through Portland United Against Hate, to do many things to address the horizontal hate within communities, citizen to citizen. But then in the last couple of years, after the George Floyd murder by a police officer in Minneapolis, confronting the acts of political hate that the police have been inflicting upon Black citizens throughout our nation for the entire existence of police, which were started as an institution to capture and return escaped slaves. Amongst many things that I was involved with was being a clergy witness at the daily protests where nonviolent protesters were met with rioting police who were accusing us of rioting, throwing tear gas canisters at us and shooting rubber bullets and flashbangs, which are munitions of war, intentionally attacking ACLU observers and medics and reporters. And it happens to be against the Geneva Convention. It's against the rules of the law of war. But in domestic situations, police can get away with that kind of behavior with impunity. So we witnessed and we photographed and we videotaped and we testified to the city council and we testified to the state legislature. And we worked to reduce funding for the police and redirect that funding towards productive, constructive community building and protecting mechanisms. We did get launched a program that was designed to do just that, to create alternatives to policing. It was in its infancy when I left the city, and we were able to reduce police funding by 15 million, but it was a drop in the bucket. And I saw firsthand the unwillingness to see the domestic terrorism that police represented, and the unwillingness to see how our own complicity in creating policies like not just the war on drugs, but also criminalizing sex workers. And I'm not talking about sex trafficking, but sex workers. What's called something called broken windows policing, which basically gives license to the police to over police in neighborhoods that are poor, or pull people over with a taillight that's out, and target those who have cars that aren't as fancy or new. The whole host of policy, the increased militarization of the police, literally using weapons of war, tanks from the military. And it's hard to go back once you've learned all this stuff. I really recommend the book called The End of Policing by a man named Vitali, who is a professor of criminology, Jewish professor of criminology, actually. It lays all of this out. And I just feel like for me as a Jew, to not take action on this issue, I could not live with myself if I didn't take action. So if anyone else has anything they want to lift up. Something that didn't come up in this material is that Black men are killed by police at a rate 5 times, at 5 times the rate of white men. So occasionally a white man does get shot too, but it's 5 times the rate. So it's just horrific. It's just horrific. Anybody want to share anything? All right, let's just take a moment and sing together. If everyone could mute yourselves so that we don't have cacophony. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in our hearts, we do believe we shall overcome someday. We're closing in towards the end of the hour. We'll probably go over just a little bit. Feel free, of course, to leave at 7:30 if that is your hard stop. But after the 4 questions, something that's frequent that we recite in the Magid, in the storytelling of our yitziat mitrayim, of our departure from Egypt, are the plagues. And it is typical that we announce the 10 plagues, and we dip our finger in the wine or juice, and we reduce our enjoyment of that beverage by extracting a drop of wine and putting it on our plate to remember the Egyptian soldiers who were killed, who were drowned in the waters of the Sea of Reeds after we had walked through, and it folded over them so that they could not kill us. And after we do that in typical progressive circles, people are invited to announce, well, what plagues are we experiencing today? And, you know, folks say racism and sexism and homophobia and xenophobia and all the things that we know are horrible. And my friend, Koach Baruch Fraser, who is a Black trans man rabbinical student, a couple of years ago said, wait a minute. The plagues in our story weren't the oppressions. The plagues were disasters that befell the oppressors that were the instrument or the agent provocateur for our freedom. They enabled our freedom. They weren't the oppression. It wasn't, the plagues weren't the slave masters whipping us or us putting together the pyramids. So what if we, instead of doing the easy work of naming the oppressions, we thought about what might be an intervention that was rough. These plagues were rough and they impacted people, all of us who lived in the land, and they impacted the Egyptians who were slaves, not just Pharaoh and his court, right? What are the things that we can identify that would be agents of change, agents of our liberation? And to give you an example, I think Stonewall is a perfect example. Stonewall was a riot. You know, there was property damage. Bricks were thrown at cops, and it changed the trajectory of the LGBTQI movement, right? It made us a movement. It helped us be brave. And from 69 to 2022, how many years later? 60 years later, the face of the world is different. I think the uprisings that have been happening since the George Floyd murder are examples of what have been agent provocateurs in some way to help shift out of oppression. So any other thoughts? What you think might be stuff that's hard, but also is an agent of liberation? All right, that's your homework. Have conversations with your friends and, oh, Aiden, did you want to share something? No, you're just showing us your beautiful face. Okay, so take that as homework. And now I'd like to invite somebody who wants to read on page 7. We're gonna set the next part after the plagues is Dayenu. Ugh, if you had just brought us out of Egypt, that would have been enough. Ugh, if you had just given us Shabbos, that would have been enough. Ugh, if you had just given us Torah, that would have been enough. And of course, none of these things would have been enough, right? But decades ago, a bunch of queer lawyers put together a Seder for the Supreme Court where they invited all of the attorneys who tried cases in front of the Supreme Court to participate in the Seder. And this is a Dayenu that I pulled from that Seder, and I added lots more at the end because it was several years ago when they did this. So who wants to volunteer to read? Are you able, Aiden, to read now, even though you're at work? All right, why don't you take it away on page 7, starting with reader in the second half of the page.
In the 50s, members of the Mattachine Society dreamed of paradigm down public streets and pride imagined retirement homes for gay elders, Imagine refuges for gay street kids, refuges for gay street kids. Today, so many of their dreams have come true.
And you can sing it if you like, or just say it, and we'll all sing it with you. Die, die,
singing.
new. I'll sing it. How about I'll sing it? All right. Die, die, new, die, die, new, die, die, new, die, new, die, new. Continue reading.
In 1953, an issue of One magazine was impounded by the Postal Service. On its cover were the words homosexual marriage. Today, marriage equality makes headlines in papers, electronic media, and network news.
Die, die, new, die, die, new, die, die, new, die, new, die, new.
In the 50s, gay lawyers wouldn't represent gay clients or gay organizations for fear of harming their own legal careers. Today, out LGBTQ lawyers argue before the Supreme Court. In the 50s, Dr. Evelyn Hooker wouldn't dare study lesbians for fear her motivations would be held suspect. Today there are openly LGBTQ researchers and therapists.
Die, die, new, die, die, new, die, die, new, die, new, die, new.
In the 1960s, Barrett Rustin's role in the civil rights movement had to be kept behind the scenes because he was gay. Today, the Smithsonian's Museum of American History not only acknowledges his role, but also acknowledges his homosexuality.
Die, die, new, die, die, new, die, die, new, die, new, die, new.
In 1986, the Supreme Court upheld Georgia's practice of enforcing its prohibition against sodomy, only when sodomy was performed by a homosexual couple, but not when it was performed by a heterosexual couple. In 2003, Justice Kennedy wrote, "Liberty not only protects from unwarranted government intrusion into one's dwelling or other private place, but freedom extends beyond spatial bounds. Liberty presumes an autonomy of self that includes freedom of thought, belief, expression, and certain intimate conduct. This case involves liberty of the person, both in its spatial and in its more transcendent dimensions. When sexuality finds overt expression and intimate contact with another person, the conduct can be but one element in a personal bond that is more enduring, and the liberty protected by the Constitution allows homosexual persons the right to make this choice." Justice Kennedy wrote of the decisions in Bowers, "It was not correct when it was decided, and it was not correct today. It ought not to remain binding precedent. It should be and is now overruled." And Justice Scalia openly admitted the consequences given the reasoning of the majority. With justification could there possibly be for denying the benefits of marriage to homosexual couples? This case does not involve the issue of homosexual marriage, only if one entertains the belief that principle and logic have nothing to do with the decisions of this court.
Die, die, new, die, die, new, die, die, new, die, new, die, new.
In 1975, Richard Adams and Tony Sullivan were legally married during a brief window of opportunity that soon slammed shut. When they petitioned to the INS for citizenship for Australian-born Tony Sullivan, the petition, the refusal letter read, "You have failed to establish that a bona fide marital relationship can exist between two," expletive deleted. In 1996, no states granted the freedom to marry same-sex couples. Today, in all 50 states of the US and in 29 countries, same-sex couples can either marry or their marriage is recognized. In 2020, a gay man who was the mayor of a small Midwestern city was running for president of the United States. A Black lesbian is the mayor of Chicago. 150 LGBTQI plus people were elected to all kinds of offices in November 2018. Governors, senators, congresspeople, mayors, and a full array of state and city officials are LGBTQI plus.
Die, die, new, die, die, new, die, die, new, die, new, die, new. So it's not enough. It's never enough. Just like in the Seder itself, none of these individual things are enough. But it's nice to reflect on the progress that we have seen in some realms, as hard as it is today, with the current attack, not only on transgender people, but on parents of trans kids in Texas. It's mind-boggling, the hate mongering and the fear of the Republican Party, let's just say it.
I do have to say it was weird saying the word homosexual.
Yes.
It's like, do we even use that word anymore?
I know, it was part of that, their original Seder, and so I didn't edit what they had originally wrote, but I heard that, I heard you reading that and have it be weird, and it is weird. I don't say it anymore. Thank you for naming it. That's actually helpful. That's good. So the last part of our quasi Seder tonight is the second hand washing. And I'm going to invite you, if you want, to get up and wash your hands. But since we're a little bit over time, maybe you could just do a virtual hand washing, like waving your hands like that. And we're gonna sing a snippet of a psalm that the words are in front of you. There's a typo. It's ki imcha, no T at the end. Makor chaim. Ba'orcha nirei or. For with you is the source of all life. In your light we see light. In the first year of the plague, 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, 3 Seders ago, I was looking for something to sing while I was washing my hands for 22 seconds. And it turned out that this snippet of a psalm actually took 22 seconds to get through both the English and the Hebrew. And the fact that the words themselves, makor chaim, makor means actually both source and also fount or fountain of life. And so I could imagine myself as I was washing my hands, having the water, be holy water coming from the divine one that was helping dispel any harm or protect me from harm. So I want to offer you this as we have moved through some very intense material, some very difficult material, to have a practice that you can take with you as we continue to wash our hands, although I admit I don't do it as vigorously as I did in the first year of the plague. And the psalm goes like this, and we can just wave our hands in the air as if they were being sprinkled from a fountain. Ki imcha makor chaim, ki imcha makor chaim, ki imcha makor chaim, ba'orcha nirei or. For with you is the source of all life. For with you is the source of all life. For with you is the source of all life. In your light we see light. If you would be willing to end with a go round, if there's anything that you want to share about a passion, a justice passion of yours that you're working on, that you want to let us know about. You don't have to take an hour to describe the project and all the 17 ways we can plug into it, but just a couple of sentences about a piece of justice activism that's important to you, so we can ground ourselves in reality in the moment. Anybody?
Yes, encouraging registered Democrats in swing states to vote.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ava.
So Rabbi Deb, you know about the suicide prevention product that I'm creating. I just received funding from the Oregon Health Authority to move it forward. So one of the first pieces will be the one for the Jewish community. So get ready.
We'll be in touch. I'm so excited. That's fantastic. Bravo. Kol hakavod, Aidan. Yes. Jean or Joelle?
Working with refugees, Afghan refugees that are resettling in the Amherst area with Catholic Charities.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Joelle, is there anything that's close to your heart that you want to share with us?
Nothing that I'm working on right now, but I am a full-time teacher in Springfield. So making sure all students get a proper public school education is definitely near and dear to my heart.
Amen via amen. Well, there's a couple of things that I'm really passionate about, and I think at the top of the list is reparations work, both for Black and Indigenous peoples. And I can't even believe that I moved to a town that had already passed a reparations ordinance before I got here. It's like my brain exploded when I found that out. So it's like to come to a place where I don't have to do all the legwork, right? And there's a committee, you know, populated by Black people, as it should be, to decide like what's the structures and the systems and the procedures that are going to be used to implement this policy. So it doesn't yet include Indigenous people. So that feels like a place that I can help, I can plug in to. And then, you know, once the policies and procedures are put in place, just to see like how the Jewish community can support that and continue to uplift and ensure that it's as effective as it can be. It's really important to me. So thank you everyone for coming. There's at the very end of the Seder, we sing psalms from Hallel. And so we'll close with just a snippet of one psalm. It's on the last page in your handout from Psalm 118. And Ozi v'zimrat Yah vayehi li lishua is how it's pronounced in Hebrew. My strength and the song of Yah will be my salvation. So just a reminder to keep on singing no matter what's going on. You know, Emma Goldman said, if I can't dance, it's not my revolution. And I will add to that, if I can't sing, it's not my revolution. And even if you have ever been told that singing is not your thing, you just forget that. Whoever said that was wrong. You sing from the bottom of your heart with your full lungs. All right. The song goes like this. Take it with you as hopefully maybe a mantra. Ozi v'zimrat Yah vayehi li lishua. 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 Well, I want to wish you simcha and sason in this season of our liberation. Can be you continue to strengthen yourself and community and practice and memory and telling stories of triumph and success and overcoming oppression. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Joelle. And the